Assessment of mitral stenosis by echocardiography. Right panel shows the parasternal long axis view. Doming of the anterior mitral leaflet is seen well and has the appearance of hockey stick. This appearance is classical of rheumatic mitral stenosis. Paradoxical movement of the posterior mitral leaflet is also visible. Normally, posterior mitral leaflet moves posteriorly in diastole. Here there is a paradoxical anterior movement due to commissural fusion. Left atrium is dilated. Left panel shows parasternal short axis view. The mitral orifice is seen within the cross section of the left ventricle. The anterior and posterior leaflets are seen in cross section and are thickened. The commissures are fused. Parasternal long axis view will give an assessment of the subvalvar apparatus. Subvalvar fusion may result in poor results after valvotomy as they can produce secondary obstruction beyond the valve. Parasternal short axis view is used for quantitating the severity of mitral stenosis by using planimetry to measure the mitral valve orifice. Commissural fusion and calcification, if present, can be seen well on parasternal short axis view. Transmitral gradient is better assessed in apical 4-chamber view by Doppler. Associated tricuspid regurgitation, if present, can be seen on apical 4-chamber view, which will also help in estimating the right ventricular systolic pressure from the TR gradient. Parasternal short axis view in mitral stenosis showing the fish mouth appearance of the mitral orifice in cross section. Normal mitral valve cross section for comparison showing anterior and posterior mitral leaflets widely separated. Scallops of mitral leaflets are also visible more clearly in the posterior leaflet. The leaflets of normal mitral valve are thin, pliable, non-calcified and open well in diastole with valve area of 4 to 6 square centimeter. Opening of a normal mitral valve may be reduced in low cardiac output states even without significant mitral stenosis. Echocardiogram in mitral stenosis showing commissural fusion. Parasternal short axis view showing mitral valve in cross section and anterolateral and posteromedial commissures. The valve leaflets are thickened and the commissures are fused. The cut is slightly oblique as a good cut should appear circular. It is often difficult to get a good circular outline of the mitral valve due to varying anatomical features of the chambers and cardiac position. Ideally, the smallest full circle should be taken to planimeter the valve area. If it is not a full circle, the subvalvar pathology may be measured as the valve orifice. If the smallest full circle is not taken, it will be the valve proximal to the severest stenosis, that is the valve belly. M-mode echocardiogram showing the paradoxical anterior motion of the posterior mitral leaflet in diastole with reduced separation of the leaflets. Anterior mitral leaflet has certain points marked in its movement C, D, E and F. The EF slope is reduced in mitral stenosis. It becomes almost flat in severe mitral stenosis. CD is the closed position of the mitral leaflets in systole and DE is the opening excursion of the anterior mitral leaflet. A wave on M-mode echocardiogram is absent in mitral stenosis. M-mode echocardiogram in mitral stenosis showing the flat EF slope and paradoxical motion of posterior mitral leaflet. Normally, the anterior mitral leaflet shows an M-shaped anterior movement and posterior mitral leaflet shows a smaller W-shaped posterior movement. The upper panel shows the doming of the anterior mitral leaflet in diastole. Mitral stenosis with pulmonary hypertension as evidenced by the flat EF slope of the pulmonary valve M-mode echocardiogram and the shallow A wave marked by the arrow. A mid-systolic notch may also appear in severe pulmonary hypertension. When Doppler echo was not available, M-mode of the pulmonary valve was an important tool to assess pulmonary hypertension. This is a discussion on the assessment of mitral valve area by echocardiography using multiple methods. Though mitral valve area by echocardiography can be measured by multiple methods, commonly used ones are two-dimensional planimetry of valve area and pressure half-time methods because of their ease of performance. In two-dimensional planimetry, the valve area is traced out using an electronic caliper and the machine calculates the valve area. Smallest full circle is taken as the metal valve area, as larger full circles may be proximal measurements of the belly of the metal leaflets and hence not representative of the actual severity of obstruction. If it is not full circle, it may be a distal measurement or oblique measurement. Mitral valve area by planimetry on echocardiogram is usually obtained from the parasternal short axis view. It can also be obtained from the basal transgastric short axis view by transesophageal echocardiography. The inner edge of the leaflets is traced in mid-diastole. Gain setting should be optimized as high gain settings can underestimate the valve area. Two-dimensional valve area measured in this way gives an overestimate compared to that measured by three-dimensional echocardiography, especially in those with dilated left atrium. This is because better alignment at the tip of the mitral valve can be obtained by transesophageal 3D echo with excellent inter-observer and intra-observer reproducibility. 3D planimetry from the left ventricular aspect is the most accurate method of measurement of mitral valve area. Measurement of mitral valve area after balloon mitral valvotomy follows the same pattern. Measurement using real-time 3D echocardiography is superior to 2D planimetry of mitral valve area in the immediate post-mitral valvotomy period. Real-time 3D echocardiographic valve area has the best correlation with invasively determined mitral valve area in this setting. Assessment of mitral valve area by pressure half time involves Doppler echocardiography. A pressure half time of 220 millisecond corresponds to the valve area of 1 square centimeter. Pressure half time is measured from the descent of the E wave in the transmitral Doppler, usually obtained in apical 4-chamber view. PHT is the time taken for the peak transmitral gradient to fall to half its value. It will also correspond to the time taken for the transmitral velocity to fall by square root of 2, as the pressure gradient is proportional to the square of the velocity. Mitral valve area is equal to 220 by pressure half time. In this image, green cursor measures the pressure half time of the mitral stenosis jet. In this case, the pressure half time was 163 milliseconds and the estimated mitral valve area by pressure half time was 1.3 square centimeters. Smith and colleagues have shown that both two-dimensional planimetry and pressure half time methods give good estimate of mitral valve area non-invasively. They found that pressure half time method is superior to two-dimensional planimetry to assess mitral valve area in those who have undergone mitral commissurotomy. It has been shown that associated aortic regurgitation shortens the transmitral pressure half time, thereby leading to overestimation of mitral valve area by Doppler echocardiography. An earlier study had shown that mitral regurgitation does not significantly change the estimation of mitral valve area by pressure half time method. Continuity equation uses mitral and aortic flow as well as cross-sectional area of the left ventricular outflow tract to derive the mitral valve area. The area is measured by planimetry and flow measured by Doppler assessment of velocity time integral. Proximal isovelocity surface area or PISA method utilizes the flow convergence region proximal to the high velocity transmitral jet in diastole. PISA is the surface area of the hemisphere at the aliasing region of the flow convergence. PISA increases as the flow increases and with lower aliasing velocity. To reduce errors in measurement, smaller aliasing velocity must be set to get higher PISA measurement with lower chance for errors. If the flow convergence is not a true hemisphere, the angle subtended by the flow convergence at the orifice must be measured and divided by 180 to get a correction factor. The diastolic flow rate is calculated as follows. Mitral flow is equal to 2 pi r squared into angle alpha divided by 180 into aliasing velocity. R is the maximal radius of the flow convergence region in early diastole measured on the central line of the flow convergence region. V alias, aliasing velocity, Alpha by 180, correction factor accounting for the angle alpha between the mitral leaflets. Mitral valve area is then determined by dividing maximal diastolic flow rate by peak continuous wave Doppler velocity of mitral inflow, that is Vmax. PISA method is based on the same principle as the continuity equation. It has been shown to be accurate and reproducible. Proximal flow convergence can be easily visualized. Here are the first set of journal references. Second set of journal references are here. These are the third set of references. Wilkins echocardiographic score for mitral stenosis. Wilkins echocardiographic score for mitral stenosis is useful for deciding whether the valve is suitable for balloon mitral valvotomy. The score was developed based on the first 22 patients who underwent balloon mitral valvotomy at their center. Four parameters considered in Wilkins score are leaflet mobility, leaflet thickening, leaflet calcification, and subvalvular apparatus. Each parameter is graded 1 to 4 depending on the severity. Total score possible is 16. A score up to 8 is considered ideal for BMV. When the score is higher, the chance of significant mitral regurgitation as a complication of BMV is more likely. Regarding mobility, in grade 1, leaflet is highly mobile with only leaflet tip movement restricted. In grade 4, there is minimal or no movement. Other grades are in between. On the thickness aspect, leaflet thickness is near normal 4 to 5 mm in grade 1. In grade 4, there is considerable thickening of whole leaflet 8 to 10 mm or more. Grade 2 and 3 are in between. In grade 1 for calcification, there is only a single area of echo brightness. In grade 4, there is extensive brightness throughout most of the leaflet tissue. Intermediate grades are in between. Grade 1 for subvalvular thickening is just a single area of increased echo brightness. In grade 4, there is extensive thickening and shortening of all caudal structures down to the papillary muscles. Patterns in between are seen for other grades. Various other 2D echo-based scoring systems have been proposed later for the assessment of the mitral valve. These were Chen score, Reed score, Nobuyoshi score, and Cormier score. With the onset of 3D echocardiography, scores based on 3D echo has also been proposed. 3D grading might overcome the difficulty in differentiating between calcification and nodular fibrosis. Here are the first set of references on echo scoring in mitral stenosis. Second set of references on echo scoring in mitral stenosis is here. Third set of references. Discussion on low gradient severe mitral stenosis. Usually mitral stenosis is associated with high transmitral gradients. Low gradient severe mitral stenosis has been defined as mean transmitral gradient less than 10 mm of mercury in patients with mitral valve area less than or equal to 1.5 square centimeter. A low flow subgroup has been defined with left ventricular stroke volume index less than or equal to 35 ml per meter squared. In a study of 101 patients with severe rheumatic mitral stenosis who underwent balloon valvuloplasty, low gradient was present in 55 patients and low flow low gradient in 11 patients. Low flow low gradient mitral stenosis patients were older, had higher rates of atrial fibrillation, arterial afterload, subvalvular thickening, and decreased left ventricular compliance compared to high gradient mitral stenosis. 40% of those with low gradient mitral stenosis did not have symptomatic benefit compared to 18% with high gradient after valvuloplasty. European Association of Echocardiography and American Society of Echocardiography recommendation in 2009 had defined severe mitral stenosis as valve area less than 1 square centimeter. 2014 AHA-ACC guideline defines severe mitral stenosis as valve area less than or equal to 1.5 square centimeter. An earlier study of 180 patients who underwent percutaneous balloon mitral valvuloplasty found 36 patients with transmitral gradient less than or equal to 10 millimeters of mercury. 24 of these 36 patients had reduced left ventricular ejection fraction. Those with reduced left ventricular ejection fraction were noted to have left ventricular wall motion abnormalities on ventriculography. Balloon valvuloplasty did not significantly improve symptoms in those who had pre-procedure left ventricular ejection fraction less than or equal to 35%. A similar study in patients undergoing mitral valve replacement for very severe mitral stenosis has been done by Cho and associates. Among 140 patients who underwent mitral valve replacement for pure valvular mitral stenosis with valve area less than or equal to 1 square centimeter by planimetry, low gradient of less than 10 millimeters of mercury was noted in 82 patients. Low gradient patients were older and more likely to have diabetes mellitus, atrial fibrillation and female gender. Their left atrial volume index was larger and left ventricular strain during isovolumic relaxation was lower. Percentage reduction of left atrial volume index after mitral valve replacement was also smaller. Even though preoperative functional class was similar, persistent symptoms after mitral valve replacement were more common in the low gradient group. Here are the first set of journal references on low gradient severe mitral stenosis. Second set of references are here. Discussion on commotio cordis, a cause for sudden death of athletes. Commotio cordis is the term given to sudden arrhythmic death due to blunt chest trauma. Death is almost instantaneous and the victims are in ventricular fibrillation. Usually there is no structural damage to the heart or thoracic structures. Impacts which occur in the vulnerable phase of ventricular repolarization just before the peak of electrocardiographic T wave result in ventricular fibrillation. Rapid rise in ventricular pressure due to the impact possibly causes activation of ion channels by mechanoelectric coupling. This causes a ventricular ectopic beat which triggers ventricular fibrillation. Commotio cordis has to be differentiated from contusio cordis, in which there is direct myocardial tissue damage and damage to overlying structures of the chest due to a high velocity projectile impact. Generally, commotio cordis is caused by impact by a ball with a dense solid core like baseball. Balls with non-solid core tend to collapse on contact and absorb most of the impact energy, so that commotio cordis is quite rare with impact by an air-filled soccer ball. Commotio cordis is more likely to occur in younger individuals, possibly because of greater transmission of the impact energy by a compliant chest wall. 95% of cases occur in adolescent males with a mean age of 14 years. Poor survival of commotio cordis of 16% was reported in 2002 from the US Commotio cordis registry. In the same report, 28% of the participants were wearing commercially available chest barriers. Of these, in 7, the projectile had made direct contact with the protective padding, and 2 were with a baseball specifically designed to reduce risk. Improved survival has been reported in later publications. Overall survival in a report from the same registry in 2013 was 28%. The survival had improved to 58% during the last 6-year period of the report, which was only 10% in the initial part of the study between 1970 and 1993. As expected, higher survival rates were there in resuscitation within 3 minutes, that is 40%, versus 4% for resuscitation after 3 minutes. Use of on-site automated external defibrillator was also protective. In an experimental study using baseballs, the threshold for causing VF was between 40 to 48 km per hour. Peak incidence was at impacts at 64 km per hour. The likelihood of VF decreased at velocities above 80 km per hour. This was in concordance with the clinical scenario of commotio cordis in youth baseball with estimated velocities in the range of 48 to 80 km per hour. All resuscitated victims should undergo thorough evaluation for underlying cardiac pathology and susceptibility to arrhythmias. Though they may resume training and competition later, if no underlying cardiac abnormality is identified, certain riders have to be considered. There is some animal data for individual susceptibility to commotio cordis. It would be prudent to avoid sports that involve chest wall impact. Maturation of chest wall with age can also reduce risk of recurrent commotio cordis. According to FIFA sudden death registry of sudden death in worldwide football from 2014 to 2018, a total of 617 players with sudden death were reported from 67 countries, of which 23% survived. This prospective study reported that traumatic sudden death, including commotio cordis, occurred infrequently, 6%. Discussion on complex fractionated atrial electrograms. Complex fractionated atrial electrograms were offered as a tool for substrate mapping and ablation in atrial fibrillation by Nadhimani and colleagues in 2004. But there is a lack of consensus on the definition of CFAE as well as the definite role in ablation of atrial fibrillation. Complex fractionated atrial electrograms may be found at areas of slow conduction, pivot point of turning wavelets, wave collision, fibrillary conduction, rotor meandering, as well as due to autonomic activation. But all CFAEs may not be the driver source for atrial fibrillation. This has an important implication in that searching for and ablating all CFAE locations may be time consuming and produce unnecessary atrial scarring or even atrial mechanical dysfunction. Moreover, temporal variability of CFAE locations have also been described, questioning the utility of CFAE mapping. Narayan and colleagues have classified CFAE into 4 types using monophasic action potentials. Type 1, CFAE with rapid, regular and pansystolic activation. Type 2, acceleration dependent CFAE, both contributing 8% each. Type 3, CFAE due to non-local or far-field electrogram detection, which appears to be the commonest variety, 67%. Type 4, CFAE without discrete monophasic action potential and disorganized atrial fibrillation, which constituted 17%. It may be noted that CFAE due to far field signals may not be ideal ablation sites. The STAR-AF2 trial evaluated 3 strategies for ablation of persistent atrial fibrillation. The strategies were pulmonary vein isolation plus CFAE ablation, and pulmonary vein isolation plus linear lesions. The study randomized 589 patients with persistent atrial fibrillation. Procedure time was significantly shorter for pulmonary vein isolation alone as expected. After 18 months, the percentage of patients free of recurrent atrial fibrillation in the 3 groups were 59%, 49% and 46% respectively, but the difference was not statistically significant. Another smaller study randomized 92 patients with persistent atrial fibrillation to pulmonary vein isolation plus ablation of CFAE or pulmonary vein isolation plus additional linear ablation across the left atrial roof and mitral valve isthmus. Follow-up was longer for a period of 5 years. At 12 months follow-up, AF recurrence rates were 21% and 23% respectively. At a mean follow-up of 59 plus minus 36 months, the figures were 44.6% and 48.3% respectively, which was not a statistically significant difference. Authors concluded that among patients with persistent AF, there was no difference in maintenance of sinus rhythm between CFA ablation or linear ablation performed in addition to pulmonary vein isolation, either in short-term or long-term follow-up. Discussion on congenitally corrected transposition of great arteries. Congenitally corrected transposition of great arteries is a condition in which there is atrioventricular and ventricular arterial discordance so that the circulation is physiological. Congenitally corrected transposition of great arteries is also known as L transposition of great arteries because of the levo transposition of the aorta. Levo post aorta forms a hump along the left upper heart border on chest X-ray. In this case, there is also mesocardia or centrally located heart. 25% cases of corrected transposition of great arteries have either dextrocardia or mesocardia. The right atrium connects to the morphological left ventricle, which in turn connects to the pulmonary artery so that systemic venous blood reaches the pulmonary circulation. The left atrium is connected to the morphological right ventricle, which ejects to the aorta, thereby ensuring that pulmonary venous drainage reaches the systemic circulation. Thus, there is a double discordance with atrioventricular and ventriculo-arterial discordance, even though it might appear that physiology of independent series pulmonary and systemic circulations is conceptually proper. The prognosis of patients with CCTGA is not that good, even in the absence of other associated cardiac defects. Hence, the need for surgical correction. Definitive surgical correction of CCTGA is known as double switch. Atrial switch is by a modified Senning procedure for rerouting the pulmonary and systemic venous return. Arterial switch is done for correction of ventriculo-arterial discordance. The morphological right ventricle fails in 1/3 of cases in those without associated lesions by the 5th decade of life, while it occurs in 2/3 who had prior surgery for associated lesions by 45 years of age. This is despite the fact that a nonagenarian has presented with CCTGA. The systemic right ventricle, supplied by a single right coronary artery, has myocardial oxygen supply-demand mismatch, which can lead to subendocardial ischemia, progressive fibrosis, and overt heart failure later. CCTGA accounts for about 1% of patients born with congenital heart disease. Of these, only 1% have uncomplicated CCTGA. Commonly associated abnormalities are pulmonary stenosis, ventricular septal defect, and Epstein-like tricuspid valve. As the atrioventricular node is in an unusual position and abnormal course of the conduction system, cardiac conduction disorders are frequent in CCTGA. Atrial situs can be normal or inverted in CCTGA. Normal atrial situs is more common. Congenital complete heart block was found in 15 of the 30 cases with normal atrial arrangement in a series, but it was not seen in any of the 8 cases with situs inversus in that series. Since the atrioventricular valves are a property of the ventricles, the systemic right ventricle in this case has a tricuspid valve. Hence, it is prone for deformities affecting the tricuspid valve. In up to 70% cases of CCTGA, systemic AV valve may be displaced inferiorly, the Epstein's anomaly. This abnormal systemic AV valve is an important cause for regurgitation rather than ventricular dilatation and dysfunction. Systemic AV valve was the only independent predictor of death in congenitally corrected transposition of great arteries in certain series. The prognosis becomes poor when systemic AV valve replacement is delayed and the systemic ventricular ejection fraction falls significantly. 10-year survival after systemic AV valve replacement was only about 20%, when the preoperative systemic ventricular ejection fraction was below 44% in earlier studies. In a series from Mayo Clinic, it was found that late systemic ventricular ejection fraction beyond 1 year was preserved in 63% of those who underwent surgery with systemic ventricular ejection fraction of 40% or more, while it was seen in only 10.5% of those who underwent surgery with systemic ventricular ejection fraction less than 40%. A systemic ventricular ejection fraction of 40% or less, subpulmonary ventricular systolic pressure 50 millimeters of mercury or more, atrial fibrillation, and a poor NYHA class 3 or 4 were the preoperative factors associated with late mortality. The authors recommended that systemic AV valve replacement in those with CCTGA and systemic AV valve regurgitation should be advised before the systemic ventricular ejection fraction falls below 40% and the subpulmonary ventricular systolic pressure rises above 50 millimeters of mercury. Discussion on coronary venous circulation. Importance of knowing the coronary venous circulation has increased in recent years with use of cardiac resynchronization therapy for heart failure. Left ventricular epicardial pacing in CRT is achieved by pacing a lead in a coronary vein, usually a posterolateral tributary of the coronary sinus. Coronary venous circulation can be visualized by a coronary angiogram levo phase. After filling the coronary arteries, the contrast drains into the coronary venous system, finally opacifying the coronary sinus, which drains into the right atrium. Here is a coronary angiogram levo phase with a line diagram beside it. To get better visualization of the coronary sinus and its tributaries, a balloon occlusion angiography of the coronary sinus is done by cannulating it retrogradely from the right atrium. But that is done only just prior to CRT, as there is a small risk of coronary sinus dissection. The veins visualized in a coronary angiogram levo phase will also depend on the coronary artery in which contrast is injected. Coronary venous circulation has been divided into a greater cardiac venous system, which drains into the coronary sinus, and a smaller cardiac venous system which drains into cardiac chambers. Smaller cardiac venous system is constituted mainly by the Thebesian veins. Coronary sinus is the largest cardiac vein with multiple tributaries. It is located in the left posterior atrioventricular groove and empties directly into the right atrium through the coronary sinus ostium. Tributaries of the coronary sinus are the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, small cardiac vein, left posterior left ventricular vein, and oblique cardiac vein. Great cardiac vein starts from the apex and drains upwards in the anterior interventricular sulcus. In the initial part, it is also known as anterior interventricular vein. In the anterior interventricular groove, it lies alongside the left anterior descending coronary artery. At the base of the heart, it travels leftwards and curves posteriorly near the left atrial appendage. Posteriorly, it converges with the oblique vein of the left atrium or oblique vein of Marshall and forms the coronary sinus. Oblique vein of Marshall is the residua of the embryonic left superior cardinal vein. Middle cardiac vein also originates at the apex but drains the posterior side of the heart and is situated in the posterior interventricular sulcus and empties into the coronary sinus. It runs along the posterior descending coronary artery but in reverse direction. Small cardiac vein is in the posterior part of the right atrioventricular sulcus. It also drains into the coronary sinus. Valve at the ostium of the coronary sinus is known as Thebesian valve. Valve at the ostium of the posterolateral vein at the junction of the great cardiac vein and coronary sinus is called Vuisson's valve. These valves can cause difficulties during ablation and CRT procedures. Another practical importance of the coronary venous system is that oblique vein of Marshall can give rise to atrial fibrillation. Three reasons described are the myocardial extensions into the structure, node-like remnants within the vein, and the rich autonomic innervation surrounding it. Early repolarization, benign or malignant? Early repolarization syndrome or pattern in the ECG has been thought to be a benign normal variant pattern for a long time. But some recent articles have linked it with idiopathic ventricular fibrillation. Others have found it to be linked with cardiac channelopathies like Brugada syndrome with a malignant course. It has been proposed that early repolarization pattern, if found in infralateral leads, have a more sinister connotation than in the classical anterolateral leads. The J wave is thought to have more malignant nature than the classical concave upwards ST segment elevation of early repolarization syndrome. The J wave itself has been described as two types. One as a slurring of the terminal QRS in the region of the J point with smooth transition to the ST segment, and another with a notch of positive spike at the end of the QRS. It may be noted that anterior upsloping ST segment elevation can be present without the early repolarization, which is now recognized to be a normal pattern in young males. Recognition of this fact has even resulted in revision of criteria for diagnosis of ST elevation myocardial infarction, where more ST segment elevation is required in anterior leads than other leads. Anslavitz and colleagues divided early repolarization syndrome into three types. Type 1 was early repolarization pattern predominantly in lateral leads, prevalent in healthy male athletes. Type 2 was predominantly in inferior and infralateral leads and associated with a higher level of risk. Type 3 displayed early repolarization pattern globally in inferior lateral and right precordial leads and was associated with highest level of risk for development of malignant arrhythmias and ventricular fibrillation storms. ECG showing early repolarization syndrome. Concave upwards ST segment elevation with notch at the end of the QRS complex or a slurring of the terminal QRS seen in lateral leads is characteristic of early repolarization syndrome. This one apparently belongs to the type 1 described above. Sasher and colleagues mentioned that having an ERPS pattern is not a disease by itself, but it is crucial to give importance when there is a family history of sudden cardiac death and in patients with syncope having dramatic J-point elevation and a descending or horizontal ST segment. They mentioned that even though 5% of Caucasian population may have this ECG pattern, only 1 in 2,500 are at risk of ventricular fibrillation. Another ECG showing early repolarization syndrome as evidenced by the concave upwards ST segment elevation in leads V2 to V6. A closely similar pattern can occur in hyperacute phase of myocardial infarction. Moreover, persons with ERPS can also develop myocardial infarction. So, if the clinical history is suggestive of ischemic cardiac pain, it is better to have follow-up with serial ECGs and troponin estimations. The ECG pattern of ERPS can be abolished by exercise or atropine, which increases the heart rate. Potassium administration may also abolish the change, but these methods are not to be adopted in a person with suspected acute coronary syndrome. There are studies which find no association between ERPS and cardiac mortality. In a study of 29,281 ambulatory patients, they found components of ERPS associated with decreased cardiovascular mortality, which was not significant after adjustment for age. This was because the patterns were more common in young individuals. A meta-analysis included 29 studies with 182,135 subjects in the general population and 14 studies with 8,087 subjects in physically active individuals. Worldwide prevalence of early repolarization pattern in general population was 11.6%. They found higher incidence of 17% in males versus 6.2% in females. Prevalence of early repolarization pattern in physically active individuals was 33.9%. Discussion on echocardiographic evaluation of aortic regurgitation demonstrated through multiple images. Echocardiogram in parasternal long axis view shows dilated left ventricle, left atrium, aorta and a small portion of the right ventricle, which is usually the outflow region. Mitral valve leaflets seen in open position between the left ventricle and the left atrium are thickened. The large aortic regurgitation jet can be seen as a mosaic jet in the left ventricular outflow tract anterior to the anterior mitral leaflet. A portion of the thickened aortic valve can be seen between the aorta and the left ventricle. The AR jet is almost filling the left ventricular outflow tract and extends well into the left ventricle beyond the anterior mitral leaflet, indicating a free aortic regurgitation. Dilated left ventricle, aorta and left atrium also suggest that the AR is severe. Apical 5-chamber view shows the dilated left ventricle, thickened anterior mitral leaflet and posterior mitral leaflet. In this view also, the AR jet is large, extending deep into the LV, indicating severe AR. Thickening of both aortic and mitral leaflets indicate the possible etiology as rheumatic. Mitral and aortic valves are the most often involved valves in rheumatic heart disease, the former being more common between the two. When there is associated mitral stenosis, the color Doppler jet of mitral flow merges with that of the aortic regurgitation in the left ventricle, as both occur in diastole. But the velocity of aortic regurgitation jet is much higher than that of mitral stenosis, as the pressure difference between aorta and left ventricle in diastole is much higher than that between left atrium and left ventricle. This is a parasternal long axis view from another case. Aortic valve is seen as grossly thickened and calcified. The right panel shows the multicolored jet of aortic regurgitation along the ventricular surface of the anterior mitral leaflet. This is quite an eccentric AR jet, and hence assessment of severity will be difficult. Here is another eccentric jet of aortic regurgitation going along the posterior margin of the left ventricular outflow tract or the anterior mitral leaflet. The systolic frame on the right shows the mitral valve in the closed position, while the diastolic frame on the left shows it in open position. The anterior mitral leaflet shows a reverse doming as the aortic regurgitation jet strikes it. Systolic frame also shows a trivial mitral regurgitation into the left atrium, just behind the mitral valve as a bluish mosaic jet. Measurement of vena contracta, or the width of the proximal regurgitant jet for grading aortic regurgitation, becomes unreliable when the jet is eccentric. In central jets, a jet width less than 0.3 cm is highly specific for mild AR, and a width more than 0.6 cm is highly specific for severe AR. Eccentric aortic regurgitation has been described in patients with right coronary cusp prolapse complicating a ventricular septal defect. In a study of 129 patients, 27 had moderate aortic regurgitation. Of these, 14 had eccentric aortic regurgitation jets. One of the patients who had mild aortic regurgitation initially had eccentric jet when it progressed to moderate AR. Eccentric aortic regurgitation has been reported in ascending aortic aneurysm. As the usual assessment of severity was erroneous, proximal isovelocity surface area (PISA) method had to be used for quantification of aortic regurgitation. PISA method has been described in another video on this channel. 5 of the 9 patients with mild eccentric AR jets progressed to moderate eccentric AR jets. At the same time, only 7 of 105 who had mild central AR progressed to moderate AR. The authors concluded that eccentric AR is highly likely to progress and is malignant. Here we have both continuous wave Doppler and color Doppler imaging from apical 5-chamber view side by side. The right panel shows continuous wave of aortic regurgitation jet. Below the baseline, forward aortic flow is seen, while above the baseline, the tongue-shaped aortic regurgitation jet is seen. Apical 5-chamber view in the left panel shows color Doppler image of aortic regurgitation with a wide multicolored jet originating from the closed aortic valve into the left ventricle. From extent of the AR jet into the left ventricle, it is moderately severe AR. Parasternal long axis view showing a small AR jet. Such a small AR jet will be taken as trivial AR with no hemodynamic significance. Left atrium and left ventricle are not dilated. Trivial aortic regurgitation on Doppler interrogation from the apical 5-chamber view, which is seen as 2D image in the upper panel. Incomplete image of the jet is obtained when the regurgitant flow is less, as in trivial or mild AR. The jet seen below the baseline is the forward aortic flow in systole, whereas AR occurs in diastole and is seen above the baseline. This is because the regurgitant flow into the left ventricle is towards the transducer in this view. The forward velocity is about 1.2 meter per second, indicating the absence of any associated aortic stenosis. The color bar on the top left indicates that the Nyquist limit of the color Doppler imaging has been set at 60 cm per second. The scale on the left lower side is the Doppler scale in meters per second, with positive values above the baseline and negative values below the baseline. In the apical 5-chamber view, the aortic forward flow is away from the transducer and is depicted negative, while the regurgitant flow is towards the transducer and depicted positive. Picture demonstrates measurement of pressure half time of aortic regurgitation jet using continuous wave Doppler from the apical 5-chamber view. Apical 5-chamber view with color Doppler is seen in the upper right corner of the image. The Doppler cursor is seen passing through the left ventricular outflow tract and aorta. AR jet is seen as the positive tracing above the baseline. The peak velocity of the AR jet is shown as 4.7 meters per second. AR PHT is shown as 453 milliseconds. The AR deceleration slope is shown as 310 centimeters per second squared. Pressure half time is the time required for the peak pressure gradient to reduce by half, which will correspond to a decrease in peak velocity by a factor of square root of 2. PHT of a regurgitant jet depends on the severity of regurgitation and the compliance of the receiving chamber. If the compliance of the receiving chamber is low, the pressure in the receiving chamber rises rapidly and the pressure gradient decreases rapidly, leading to a steep slope of the Doppler tracing and a low pressure half time. This is the usual situation in an acute aortic regurgitation when the receiving chamber does not get much time to dilate and accommodate the regurgitant flow. Severe regurgitation also gives a similar picture as the receiving chamber fills rapidly. PHT measurement by Doppler echocardiography is useful in assessing the severity of aortic regurgitation. The severity of aortic regurgitation has been classified according to the pressure half time as follows. Mild AR, PHT more than 500 milliseconds. Moderate AR, PHT between 200 to 500 milliseconds. Severe AR, PHT less than 200 milliseconds. As mentioned above, PHT depends on the compliance of the receiving chamber and hence it can be reduced by elevated LV diastolic pressure. On the contrary, it can be prolonged if the peripheral resistance is increased and when the aorta is dilated and having a higher compliance. Vasodilator therapy can reduce PHT in AR. Discussion on ischemic preconditioning. The concept of ischemic preconditioning is that multiple short episodes of ischemia can protect the heart from a later sustained ischemia. In an experimental study, 4 episodes of 5 minutes each, separated by 5 minutes of reperfusion, followed by 40 minutes of occlusion, showed 75% reduction in infarct size compared to controls. But this benefit was not there when the final occlusion time was 3 hours. Authors suggested that multiple pre-infarction anginal episodes may have a similar effect on limiting infarct size if myocardial infarction occurs subsequently. Others have suggested that similar mechanism might operate in warm-up phenomenon in angina. Intermittent ischemia during aortic cross-clamping in fibrillating heart during coronary artery bypass surgery is also a clinical model of ischemic preconditioning. Ischemic preconditioning has also been studied during percutaneous coronary intervention. Clinical ECG and coronary hemodynamic responses to sequential 90-second balloon occlusions of left anterior descending coronary artery were assessed in 12 patients. Compared to the initial balloon occlusion, anginal discomfort was less in the second occlusion. Similarly, ST segment shift and mean pulmonary artery pressure was significantly lower in the second occlusion. Myocardial lactate production was also significantly during the second balloon occlusion. It has been shown that ischemic preconditioning during coronary angioplasty is prevented by glibenclamide, which is a selective ATP-sensitive potassium channel blocker. In placebo-treated patients in that study, severity of cardiac pain and the ST segment shift was lower after a second 2-minute balloon inflation. But in the glibenclamide-treated patients, ST segment shift was similar to that during first inflation. The severity of cardiac pain was greater after the second inflation. This might explain the observation that patients receiving the earlier generation oral hypoglycemic agents for diabetes mellitus were at increased risk of cardiovascular mortality. Those oral hypoglycemic agents were inhibitors of ATP-sensitive potassium channel. Ischemic preconditioning is mediated by the activation of KATP channel. EMISTAR-2 trial showed that infarct size was reduced with 70 microgram per kilogram per minute adenosine infusion and was correlated with fewer adverse clinical events. But the whole study did not show significant improvement of clinical outcomes in patients with STEMI undergoing reperfusion therapy along with adenosine infusion. The authors mentioned that a larger study with the 70 microgram per kg per minute adenosine infusion is warranted. Stimulation of adenosine receptors is known to simulate ischemic preconditioning. Nicorandil is a KATP channel opener. The significant clinical improvement in outcome due to a reduction in major coronary events noted in the IONA study of nicorandil in stable angina patients could be explained by its effect on KATP channel, which is similar to ischemic preconditioning. Using drugs to mimic ischemic preconditioning has been called pharmacological preconditioning. Remote ischemic preconditioning can be done by inducing ischemia in another vascular territory. A multi-center randomized trial involving 1,403 patients assessed the role of remote ischemic preconditioning prior to cardiac surgery. Primary composite endpoint included death, myocardial infarction, stroke, and acute renal failure up to the time of hospital discharge. Secondary endpoint was the occurrence of the components of the primary endpoint within 90 days. Upper limb remote ischemic preconditioning done while patients were under propofol-induced anesthesia did not show a relevant benefit among patients undergoing elective cardiac surgery. Discussion on leadless pacemakers. Weakest link in the pacemaker system is considered to be its lead, sometimes called its Achilles heel. This is because the lead system is prone for infection, fracture, failure, and dislodgement. The more the number of the leads, the more the complications, as in sophisticated systems like dual chamber pacemakers and biventricular pacing devices. The incidence is compounded over time with longevity of the device and the recipient. The risk of lead extraction is also significantly high in case it is needed, hence the need for a leadless pacemaker system. Micra transcatheter pacemaker system can be delivered percutaneously using a delivery system via the femoral vein. It provides right ventricular sensing, pacing, and rate responsiveness. It uses an accelerometer sensor for rate responsiveness. The device is delivered in the right ventricle. Micra transcatheter pacing study group successfully implanted the device in 719 of 725 patients enrolled for a multi-center study. Primary safety endpoint was freedom from system-related or procedure-related major complications. Primary efficacy endpoint was percentage of patients with low and stable pacing capture thresholds at 6 months. Cutoff was 2 volt or less at a pulse width of 0.24 milliseconds and an increase of 1.5 volts or less from the time of implantation. Major complications were compared with those in a control cohort of 2,667 patients with transvenous pacemakers from 6 studies published earlier. Rate of primary safety endpoint was 96% and primary efficacy endpoint 98.3%. Complication rates were significantly lesser than the historical control cohort. A feasibility study of accelerometer-based atrioventricular synchronous pacing with a ventricular leadless pacemaker was published in 2018. Micro has a 3-axis accelerometer. They developed a custom software to detect atrial contraction using the accelerometer to enable AV synchronous pacing. The Marvel study tested the algorithm downloaded into previously implanted Micra devices. AV synchrony was defined as visible P wave on surface ECG followed by a ventricular event in less than 300 milliseconds. A total of 64 patients in 12 centers across 9 countries were evaluated. Patients were implanted with a Micra for a median period of 6 months. 33 had high-grade AV block while 31 had intrinsic AV conduction during the study. Average duration of AV algorithm pacing was 87% in those with high-grade AV block. 94.4% AV synchrony was noted in those with intrinsic conduction. Here the pacemaker senses the mechanical activity of the atrium rather than the electrical activity which is sensed by conventional AV sequential pacemakers. In an innovative case report, a new leadless pacemaker was synchronized with an existing transvenous atrial pacemaker. Patient had sinus node dysfunction and intermittent Mobitz type 2 AV block for which a dual chamber pacemaker was implanted earlier. Pacemaker interrogation after syncopal episode showed right ventricular lead threshold of 5.5 volts at a pulse width of 1 milliseconds. There was only less than 1% right ventricular pacing and there was a previously documented chronic malfunction of right ventricular lead with impedance more than 3000 ohms. Atrial lead was stable with intact parameters. Patient was on hemodialysis using a left arm arteriovenous fistula for end-stage renal disease. Hence, risk of bleeding and infection for lead extraction and implantation of a new lead on the left side was deemed high. Considering all aspects, they decided to go for a leadless pacemaker and a Micra AV was implanted. Previous pacemaker was programmed to atrial pacing, atrial sensing, inhibited mode. Micra AV was synchronized to the atrial contraction resulting from atrial pacing of the previous transvenous pacemaker. Thus, the patient had two pacemakers interacting to produce AV synchrony after careful programming. A systematic review and meta-analysis on safety and efficacy of leadless pacemaker has been published. They identified 36 observational studies of nanostim and Micra leadless pacemakers, of which 69.4% reported outcomes for Micra. In 5 studies with 1-year follow-up, Micra was associated with 51% lower odds of complications compared with transvenous pacemakers. 98.96% of the 1,376 patients implanted with Micra had good pacing capture thresholds. They concluded that studies report outcomes for Micra associated with a low risk of complications and good electrical performance up to 1 year after implantation. They opined that further randomized controlled trials are needed to support the widespread adoption of these devices in clinical practice. Discussion on myocardial stenting and hibernation. Myocardial stenting is reversible myocardial dysfunction after ischemia and reperfusion. It is different from myocardial hibernation, in which persistent chronic ischemia causes myocardial dysfunction, which is reversible after revascularization. Mechanism of myocardial stenting is thought to be either due to oxygen-free radicals or calcium overload produced by the ischemia reperfusion sequence. Myocardial stenting is the reason for persistent left ventricular dysfunction for hours or even up to a few days after successful reperfusion in acute myocardial infarction. This can be noted after reperfusion by thrombolysis or percutaneous coronary intervention. Repetitive episodes of stenting secondary to ischemia can lead on to hibernation. Lower myocardial necrosis, as suggested by a lower peak creatinine kinase level, has been shown to be an independent predictor of recovery of ventricular function. Though almost half of the recovery of left ventricular function occurs later, the ejection fraction achieved on third day after myocardial infarction is predictive of survival. Hibernating myocardium is a chronically ischemic myocardium, the function of which improves after successful revascularization. Short of revascularization, presence of hibernating myocardium can be documented by improvement in regional or global function of the left ventricle in response to nitrates, inotropes, and post-extrasystolic potentiation. Nitrates delivered sublingually or as an infusion during a wall motion study, either by echocardiography or by nuclear perfusion imaging, can document improvement in wall motion due to improvement in the circulation. Inotropic stimulation during echocardiography can also document similar improvement in wall motion during low dose stimulation. Post-extrasystolic potentiation is a simpler method as it does not involve any additional measures, only just longer period of imaging. The beat after a ventricular premature beat has natural augmentation of inotropic state of the myocardium due to increased availability of intracellular calcium. The ectopic beat, though it releases calcium, does not utilize it fully. Hence, part of it is available during the post-extrasystolic beat in addition to the regular amount of calcium being released during the index beat. The extra calcium invokes an inotropic response in the hibernating myocardium, which manifests as an improvement in wall motion during echocardiography or perfusion imaging. Myocardial hibernation can be considered as an adaptive response of the myocardium to chronic ischemia to improve survival of the myocytes. As the chronic ischemia progresses, there seems to be a perfusion contraction mismatch which occurs to preserve viability. A non-contracting myocardium needs only less amount of aerobic metabolism to maintain viability. Dobutamine stress echocardiography, myocardial contrast echocardiography, single photon emission computed tomography, and positron emission tomography are the important modalities of assessing myocardial viability and thereby establishing the possibility of hibernating myocardium in the setting of chronic ischemia. You may wish to check out another video on this channel on assessment of myocardial viability. Myocardial contractility recovers significantly in hibernating myocardium after successful revascularization, but the period needed for recovery varies depending on the duration and severity of ischemia which induced the hibernation. In chronic severe hypoperfusion, it may take several weeks for the completion of recovery process. This is because the amount of contractile proteins may have decreased due to the catabolic wasting which occurred during the chronic ischemia. New protein synthesis after successful revascularization takes a longer period. Discussion on percutaneous pulmonary valve implantation. Percutaneous pulmonary valve implantation has the elite distinction that it was the first percutaneous intervention for a regurgitant lesion in humans. Bonhoeffer and colleagues described the development of a system for percutaneous stent implantation combined with valve replacement for right ventricle to pulmonary artery prosthetic conduit with valve dysfunction. They used it in a 12-year-old boy with stenosis and regurgitation of a prosthetic conduit from right ventricle to pulmonary artery. Percutaneous implantation of bovine jugular valve in the conduit was successfully achieved in 2000. Echo, angio and hemodynamic assessment showed no residual regurgitation and partial relief of conduit stenosis. There were no complications and patient was in good physical condition at 1 month follow-up. A report of 58 patients with a mean age of 16 years was published in 2005. Majority had variants of tetralogy of Fallot or transposition of great arteries with ventricular septal defect and pulmonary stenosis. They had undergone right ventricular outflow tract reconstruction in infancy with valve conduit and presented in later life for re-intervention for pulmonary regurgitation and stenosis. There was significant fall in right ventricular pressure, right ventricular outflow tract gradient, and pulmonary regurgitation. There was no mortality in the series. Data on 155 patients was published in 2008. Follow-up was up to 83.7 months. Freedom from reoperation was 70% at 70 months. Freedom from transcatheter re-intervention was 73% at 70 months. Survival at 83 months was 96.9%. First series of 50 patients and patients with a residual gradient more than 25 millimeters of mercury were associated with higher risk of reoperations. A review on percutaneous pulmonary valve implantation in 2015 opined that it is a safe and effective procedure. The procedure has the potential to improve symptoms, functional capacity, and biventricular hemodynamics. Limitation noted was that eligibility for the procedure was in less than 1/4 of the patients with right ventricular outflow tract dysfunction. The Melody valve crimped over a balloon-in-balloon catheter was delivered through a 22F long sheath balloon catheter. 18 mm device could be expanded up to 22 mm. Coronary compression by the implanted valve is a rare but significant problem with percutaneous pulmonary valve implantation. Balloon coronary test has been used to check for the likelihood of coronary compression, but it is not foolproof and could have high false positive rate. When a short valve is needed, manual shortening of the Melody device has been used and is known as folded Melody valve technique. It has been shown to be a safe technique with favorable outcomes up to 6.5 years after implantation in a retrospective study of 49 patients. Discussion on right ventricular infarction. Right ventricular infarction can be associated with inferior wall infarction. It is due to occlusion of the right ventricular branches of the right coronary artery. The actual prevalence of right ventricular infarction may be underestimated because right-sided chest leads are not part of routine 12-lead ECG. In a study which included right-sided chest leads V3R, V4R, V5R and V6R, ST elevation of 1 mm or more in any of these leads was found to be a reliable sign of RV involvement. It was a study of 67 patients who underwent serial ECG, 99M technetium pyrophosphate scintigraphy, and a dynamic flow study to document RV infarction. They noted that ST elevation of 1 mm or more in V4R had the greatest sensitivity of 93% and predictive accuracy of 93% for RV infarction. Of special interest was the observation that ST elevation in right precordial leads was short-lived, disappearing in 10 hours in half of the patients with RV infarction. So, recording right chest leads within 10 hours of onset of chest pain is important in picking up RV infarction. RV infarction decreases its output and consequently the LV preload, leading to a decrease in cardiac output. Profound hypotension can be noted in some cases. The ischemic RV is stiff and volume dependent, thereby explaining the role of fluid resuscitation in RV infarction with hypotension. Cardiac output can be enhanced by right atrial contraction, which increases RV filling if the coronary occlusion is distal to the origin of right atrial branches. But more proximal occlusion results in impaired RV filling and performance due to the loss of right atrial help. Bradycardia, which is often associated with inferior wall infarction, also limit the cardiac output in this situation. Here is a right coronary angiogram showing right ventricular branches. Relatively proximal total occlusion of right coronary artery is shown here. Hardly any RV branches are seen. A small branch is seen just proximal to the occlusion and another more proximally. These could be right atrial branches. Right atrium is usually supplied by an anterior artery which often gives rise to the sinus node artery and a lateral artery which supplies the right atrial free wall. The term right ventricular infarction has been called as a misnomer because most of the right ventricular dysfunction is due to ischemic but viable myocardium. Right ventricle is perfused both in systole and diastole, unlike the left ventricle, because of the lower intracavitary systolic pressure. Thin RV wall can also derive oxygenation from the blood in the cavity as well as through Thebesian veins, even in the presence of coronary occlusion. Generally, RV function recovers even in the absence of reperfusion, but the recovery can be slow and associated with high in-hospital mortality. Of course, reperfusion enhances recovery and improves clinical course and survival. Inferior wall infarction generally has a good prognosis with only 2 to 9% mortality in the control group of trials on thrombolytic therapy. But presence of associated RV infarction makes it a high-risk entity. Clinically, RV infarction has hypotension, elevated jugular venous pressure, which is usually 10 cm or more, with a positive Kussmaul sign. Kussmaul sign is an inspiratory increase in jugular venous pressure instead of the normal fall. Lung fields are clear as there is no elevation of pulmonary capillary pressure. Tricuspid regurgitation may be present. Clinical signs may be absent in many cases of RV infarction. Early recognition of RV infarction is important as the usually used nitrate therapy can lead to hypotension in the presence of RV infarction. Instead, volume loading and dobutamine or dopamine if needed may be considered. Those with RV infarction along with inferior wall infarction have a high risk of developing high-grade AV block. High-grade AV block was noted in 14 of 29 patients with RV involvement documented by 99M technetium pyrophosphate scintigraphy. In the same study, only 5 out of 38 patients with inferior wall infarction and no RV involvement had high-grade AV block. AV sequential pacing rather than ventricular temporary pacing has been advocated by some in inferior wall infarction with RV infarction and complete heart block. The potential risk of perforation of the ischemic RV in this scenario in a patient often restless due to hypotension and cerebral hypoperfusion has to be kept in mind. Complete reperfusion of the right coronary artery by percutaneous coronary intervention can lead to excellent recovery of RV function and excellent clinical outcome. Unsuccessful reperfusion is associated with impaired recovery of RV function with hemodynamic compromise and high mortality rate. Discussion on riociguat based on clinical trial data. Riociguat is a soluble guanylate cyclase stimulator useful in the treatment of chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary arterial hypertension. CHEST-1 trial was a phase 3 multicenter randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. 261 patients with inoperable chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension or persistent or recurrent pulmonary hypertension after pulmonary endarterectomy were randomly assigned to receive either placebo or riociguat. Primary endpoint of the study was the change in 6-minute walk distance from baseline to the end of 16th week. Secondary endpoints were change in pulmonary vascular resistance, NT-proBNP level, WHO functional class, time to clinical worsening, BOG dyspnea score, quality of life variables, and safety. 6-minute walk distance increased by a mean of 39 meters in the riociguat group as compared to a mean decrease of 6 meters in the placebo group. Pulmonary vascular resistance decreased by 226 dynes second centimeter to the power of minus 5 in the riociguat group, while it increased by 23 dynes second centimeter to the power of minus 5 in the placebo group. Significant improvements were noted in NT-proBNP level and WHO functional class. Serious adverse events were similar in both groups. CHEST-2 was an open-label extension of CHEST-1 study which evaluated the long-term safety and efficacy of riociguat. 237 patients entered CHEST-2 and 211 were ongoing at the interim analysis in March 2013. There were no new safety signals noted in CHEST-2. Improvements in 6-minute walk distance and WHO functional class persisted at 1 year. In CHEST-2, 2-year overall survival was 93% and clinical worsening-free survival was 82%. A significant association with overall survival was noted for 6-minute walk distance and NT-proBNP concentration. Change of 6-minute walk distance from baseline was also significantly associated with survival. WHO functional class at baseline and follow-up was not associated with overall survival, but it was associated with clinical worsening-free survival. Serious adverse events were noted in 54% of patients, but only 6% discontinued riociguat therapy because of adverse events. Right heart size and function by echocardiography on riociguat treatment was assessed in RIVER study. 71 patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension or chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension were included in the study. After 12 months of treatment, patients on riociguat showed significant reduction in right atrial and right ventricular area and right ventricular thickness. Significant increase in TAPSE and right ventricular fractional area change were also documented. Expert study evaluated the long-term safety of riociguat in clinical practice. It was an international multi-center prospective uncontrolled study of patients treated with riociguat. Patients were followed up for a minimum of 1 year and up to 4 years from enrollment or until 30 days after stopping riociguat treatment. 326 patients with PH were analyzed. The final data report from expert was that safety in clinical practice was consistent with clinical trials. No new safety concerns were identified. Discussion on triangle of Koch and its importance while ablating supraventricular tachycardia. Triangle of Koch is situated on the right atrial aspect of the interatrial septum. It is bounded by the septal tricuspid leaflet, tendon of Todaro, and the coronary sinus. The atrioventricular node is located at the apex of this triangle. The initial description of the triangle was by Walter Koch in 1909. Knowledge of the Koch's triangle is very important to safely perform radiofrequency catheter ablation within the right atrium. Ablation within the triangle of Koch has a risk of injury to the AV node and complete AV block. Tendon of Todaro is a collagenous subendocardial band in the right atrium. It constitutes a part of the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Tendon of Todaro runs from the central fibrous body to the eustachian ridge. Macroscopically, tendon of Todaro is visible only in the fetal and infant heart as a white structure. It involutes later and is visible only microscopically in the adult heart. One study found tendon of Todaro visible macroscopically in only 10.8% of the hearts, that too only in the younger specimens. So, in that study, they used a line joining the apex of the Koch's triangle to the point where the basal edge of the triangle touches the eustachian ridge. Apex of the triangle was found by transillumination of the membranous septum from the left ventricular side. Eustachian ridge separates the orifice of the inferior vena cava from the coronary sinus. This is a highly diagrammatic representation of the landmarks used to identify the triangle of Koch. The boundary of the triangle from the apex to the eustachian ridge marks the location of tendon of Todaro, seen histologically in the adult and macroscopically in the fetus and infant. It is the region pointed by the blue arrow for marking the triangle of Koch. Approximate position of triangle of Koch in the left anterior oblique fluoroscopic view. The tip of the quadripolar His bundle catheter marks the approximate position of the apex of the triangle. Proximal portion of the His bundle catheter will be roughly along the eustachian ridge and tendon of Todaro. Decapolar catheter in the coronary sinus identifies the base of the triangle of Koch. Tip of the ablation catheter is seen well away from the tip of the His bundle catheter to avoid ablation in the region of the compact AV node while ablating for supraventricular tachycardia. In case you need ablation of the AV node in case of atrial fibrillation with drug refractory fast ventricular rate, tip of the His bundle catheter will guide the AV nodal location. Discussion on ECG monitoring in ICU. Following are the usual goals of ECG monitoring in the intensive care unit: heart rate and basic rhythm determination, diagnosis of complex arrhythmias, detection of ischemia and prolonged QT interval. Advanced monitoring facilities may be used for following features which are yet to be well established: computerized ST segment analysis, computerized arrhythmia analysis, computerized QT interval monitoring. Over the past few decades, since the initiation of ECG monitoring in the 1960s, several improvements have occurred. They include improved noise reduction strategies, multi-lead monitoring, and derived 12-lead ECGs. Cardiac arrhythmia monitoring is needed for all patients at significant risk of immediate life-threatening arrhythmia, which include post-cardiac arrest, early phase of acute coronary syndrome, post-cardiac surgery, and after anesthesia. Battery-operated monitor defibrillators are useful while transporting such patients. Personnel watching the monitor in the ICU should have skill in ECG interpretation and defibrillation. In the setting of an acute myocardial infarction, ST segment ischemia monitoring is useful to assess the patency of culprit artery after thrombolysis, abrupt reocclusion after primary angioplasty, and to detect ongoing ischemia or infarct extension. ST segment monitoring is not useful in left bundle branch block, ventricular paced rhythm, arrhythmias that obscure the ST segment, and in patients who are agitated. Following steps are useful in improving the quality of ischemia monitoring. ST segment should be evaluated only in supine position. Careful skin preparation should be done to improve the lead contact. Consistent lead placement is needed for comparisons. Ideally, the electrode positions have to be marked with a skin marking pencil. ST alarm parameters have to be set based on the patient's baseline ST level. QT interval monitoring is useful in patients on antiarrhythmic drugs known to cause toss at the points. It is also useful in the overdose of a potentially proarrhythmic agent, patients with new onset bradyarrhythmias, and in those with severe hypokalemia or hypomagnesemia. Limb electrodes are placed on torso to reduce muscle artifact during limb movements and also to avoid tethering of the patient. Right arm and left arm electrodes are placed on the corresponding infraclavicular fossa. Left leg electrode is placed below the rib cage on the left side of the abdomen. Right leg electrode can be placed anywhere on the right side of the abdomen. Some monitors, especially defibrillator monitors, have only 3 cables. 2 of them are active and one is a ground electrode. These are usually used as modified limb lead monitors, typically in lead 2 configuration with leads attached to the torso near the limb. Modified chest leads MCL1 to MCL6 configurations can be used to monitor chest leads with 2 electrode cables. For MCL1, the negative pole is kept in the left infraclavicular fossa and positive pole in the fourth right intercostal space close to sternum in V1 position. For other MCL leads, the positive pole is shifted to the corresponding chest lead positions. Approximate position of electrodes for MCL1 monitoring lead. The combination for lead 1 can be used in reverse manner for MCL. Right arm electrode is kept in left infraclavicular fossa and left arm electrode in V1 position. Unlike the usual chest leads which are unipolar, MCL1 is bipolar. If electrodes for lead 2 are being used, left arm electrode can be placed in left infraclavicular fossa and left leg electrode in V1 position. Using multiple limb leads is possible only in monitors with 4 electrode cables, 3 active and 1 ground. Discussion on heparin-induced thrombocytopenia syndrome. Heparin-induced thrombocytopenia was described as 2 types, HIT1 and HIT2. HIT1 is a self-limiting disease and a non-immune-mediated response to heparin, which occurs within 1 to 4 days of exposure to heparin. It is not associated with thrombosis and is unlikely to worsen with continued use of heparin. HIT1 is mediated by a direct interaction between heparin and circulating platelets. This interaction causes clumping or sequestration of platelets. Thrombocytopenia is usually mild and transient and often returns to normal within 4 days of withdrawal of heparin. HIT2 or HITTS, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis syndrome, is a more dangerous form in which IgG antibodies against heparin platelet factor 4 complex are formed. It occurs within 5 to 14 days of exposure to heparin and is associated with thrombotic events. The IgG antibody binds to heparin platelet 4 complex, leading to platelet activation, platelet consumption, and thrombocytopenia. The IgG antibodies are known as HIT antibodies or HIT IgG. The antigen antibody complexes can cause production of tissue factor by their interaction with monocytes. Antibody mediated endothelial injury can also occur. These in turn can further activate the coagulation cascade. There is also a suggestion that HIT1 be renamed as non-immune heparin associated thrombopenia and HIT2 as just HIT. Many publications refer to HIT2 as just HIT. In those who have been previously exposed to heparin, the onset is earlier and can occur within hours. HIT is unlikely to be a cause for thrombocytopenia within 5 days of heparin initiation in those who have not received heparin within the previous 3 months. Direct thrombin inhibitors like bivalirudin is a drug of choice in HIT. Though the chance of developing HIT with low molecular weight heparin is lower than with conventional heparin, low molecular weight heparin cannot be used after the onset of HIT. Routine monitoring of platelet count in those receiving heparin is recommended for early detection of HIT. Higher risk patients who are receiving therapeutic doses of unfractionated heparin need at least alternate day platelet count estimation. When warfarin has to be started for conditions like deep vein thrombosis in those with HIT, it should be delayed till platelet count has fully recovered. Warfarin is started at the expected maintenance dose. Loading dose of warfarin is not given. Parenteral anticoagulation is overlapped for at least 5 days until target INR levels have been maintained for 2 days. Discussion on myocardial bridging, named signs in myocardial bridging, and classification. Normally, the epicardial coronary arteries are located outside the myocardium. Occasionally, a segment of the epicardial coronary artery passes through the myocardium. This causes a narrowing of that region when the heart contracts in systole, known as myocardial bridging. Myocardial bridging can be recognized as narrowing of a region of the coronary artery in systole, which normalizes in diastole. Usually, myocardial bridges do not cause ischemia, though rarely it can do so. Generally, myocardial bridges are left alone, though stenting of bridging areas presumably causing ischemia may be needed in some cases. Myocardial bridging is usually seen in left anterior descending coronary artery, with a segment of the artery passing beneath a myocardial bridge. Here are a few named signs in myocardial bridging. 1. Milking effect is noted on coronary angiography, indicating the systolic compression and diastolic relief of compression. 2. Step-down, step-up phenomenon can be seen both on coronary angiography still pictures and coronary CT angiography due to the effect of myocardial bridge on the coronary lumen. 3. Half-moon phenomenon is noted on intravascular ultrasound. It can occur even without the milking effect. The milking effect can be provoked in these cases. 4. Fingertip phenomenon and spike and dome pattern are descriptions for intracoronary Doppler flow patterns in myocardial bridging. Myocardial bridge muscle index is the product of myocardial bridge thickness multiplied by its length. In that autopsy study, myocardial infarction was more likely in those with a thicker bridge and higher myocardial bridge muscle index. Progression of atherosclerosis was maximum at 2 cm proximal to the entrance of the myocardial bridge in the left anterior descending coronary artery. Schwarz and colleagues have classified myocardial bridging without associated coronary artery disease into 3 types. Type A is an incidental finding on angiography without objective signs of ischemia. Type B had objective signs of ischemia. Type C with or without objective signs of ischemia but with altered intracoronary hemodynamics as assessed by quantitative coronary angiography, coronary flow reserve or intracoronary Doppler. 5-year follow-up showed that types B and C responded well to beta blockers or calcium channel blockers. Patients with type C refractory to medical therapy was treated by stenting of the myocardial bridge. Other treatment options considered in those with refractory symptoms are minimally invasive coronary artery bypass grafting and surgical myotomy. CABG is considered in case of extensive or deep myocardial bridges. Discussion on paradoxical splitting of second heart sound. Normal splitting of second heart sound is due to the delay in pulmonary valve closure compared to aortic valve. This is mostly contributed by the pulmonary hangout interval. Hangout interval is the time taken for the actual valve closure after the pulmonary artery and right ventricular pressure tracings cross over. Normal split of second heart sound closes in expiration as the reduced venous return shortens right ventricular ejection. When the split closes in inspiration and becomes audible in expiration, it is called paradoxical splitting of second heart sound. Please note that a wide split of second heart sound as in right bundle branch block or atrial septal defect will be audible in expiration, but it is also heard in inspiration, unlike a paradoxical split which closes in inspiration. An audible expiratory split may also be heard in young individuals in supine position. This physiological expiratory split closes in sitting and standing positions. Paradoxical splitting of second heart sound can also be called reverse splitting. It is due to the delay in aortic valve closure sound. In normal split of second heart sound, aortic component occurs first and is followed by pulmonary component. The sequence of A2P2 is reversed to P2A2 in reverse splitting or paradoxical splitting. Diagram of paradoxical or reverse splitting of second heart sound. Comparison with normal split is also shown. Paradoxical splitting is seen only in pathological conditions. Most common cause of paradoxical splitting of second heart sound is left bundle branch block, in which aortic closure is delayed due to the delay in left ventricular activation. Severe left ventricular dysfunction with delayed emptying of left ventricle is another cause of reverse split of second heart sound. Right ventricular ectopic beat, right ventricular paced beat, and right ventricular pre-excitation can also theoretically cause a paradoxical splitting of second heart sound due to earlier activation of right ventricle and delayed activation of left ventricle. All these conditions resemble left bundle branch block on the ECG. Paradoxical splitting of second heart sound has been reported in 10 out of 29 cases of patent ductus arteriosus in a study. Authors mentioned that it was due to difference between right and left ventricular systolic times as in aortic stenosis. In an interesting case report, late systolic click from isolated tricuspid valve simulated paradoxical splitting of second heart sound. Echocardiography with simultaneous phonocardiography was used to demonstrate this phenomenon. Respiratory variation of the tricuspid valve click in relation to the second heart sound resulted in this auscultatory phenomenon, which resembled reverse splitting of second heart sound.